Good morning, and I thank the Middle East Dialogue uh, organization for allowing us to be here.
Thank you, Professor Zoni. I'm going to introduce you real quickly. Hi, my name is Donna Hess of American Military University, and I would like to welcome you to the Middle East Peace Process Conference. We have two excellent speakers today. Our first speaker, Professor Zoni of Coppin State University, will be speaking with us first on the assessment of President Joe Biden's foreign policy and diplomacy toward the Middle East after 1 year in office. He will be speaking for approximately 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a brief portion of questions. Immediately after, Professor Fred Lazin of Gurion University will be speaking to us about the Abraham Accords 1 year later, implications for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Zoni. Professor Zoni, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the Middle East Dialogue organization and the president of the organization, or Mr. Daniel Gatzin, for he and his staff hard work. Next, please. Next. The first, we define really when we look at the Biden administration, we can, in the first year, I would say I prefer to look at the first 6 months. After that, the second 6 months. The first 6 months, really, the administration was in the process of resetting the U.S. foreign policy, and of course was going through the crisis in Afghanistan, and many things were going on in the Middle East and also in China, and dealing with COVID-19 at home. So actually, the first 6 months were very difficult for the Biden administration, particularly the administration inherited foreign policy of President Trump, which was really can be characterized as a puzzle, no consistency, using I would say using unconventional way of communicating with here in the USA and at the world through Twitter. So actually, it was a mess. So the first 6 months was really for the Biden administration was to be very cautious about the Middle East generally, and of course the Arab-Israeli issue specifically. Next, please. The Biden administration first 6 months in the Middle East focus on limiting direct U.S. involvement in the region generally and the Arab-Israeli conflict, particularly due to the crisis at home due to COVID-19 and its consequences on the economy. At the same time, there was more pressing issues, which was challenging U.S. foreign policy, which is the climate change and competition with China and Russia. Next, please. One common tune among some members of the Biden Middle East team is that we don't want any more failed states, like what happened during the Arab Spring, and where Libya as a state failed, Yemen, Syria, okay, and Egypt, the most populated Arab country, also was very close to fail as a state, which would compromise the peace in the Middle East. Particularly, Egypt is the first Arab country to sign peace agreement with Israel, which actually helped the USA to maintain its own national interest in the region, which is supporting the state of Israel. So this cautious approach, from my view, was very good, and the mistakes which U.S. foreign policymakers did during the Obama administration and also during the Trump administration, Biden administration was trying to repair some of the consequences and unintended consequences of these policies of the Trump and Obama. Next, please. The Biden administration chose to put diplomacy first by working with members of the EU, and in other words, really, it took back stage, okay, and preferred to work through members of the EU, particularly dealing with Iran, because as we know, President Trump, he ended or he backed from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. So this really was very serious issue, which actually many countries, particularly in the Middle East, maybe the Muslims, are divided to Sunni and Shia, okay, with some differences, but both the entire Muslim world, Shia and Sunni, they actually agree on one thing, that one of the Islamic countries in the Middle East has to have nuclear capability, due to the fact that Israel has nuclear capability, and everything is covered up by the USA. Of course, this is not my views, but I am expressing the views of the Muslim world, that if Israel allowed to have nuclear bomb capability, then one of the Arab or Islamic country must have. So that will be the Middle East have some balance. Okay. Also, the Biden administration actually tried to intervene to mediate or to solve the regional conflicts in Libya and in Yemen, and also in the Horn of Africa near Somalia. And but of course, it tried to use some friends of the USA, regional players such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAR. I believe, from my view, this was good because the USA really should not be involved in a very direct way in a very complicated region like the Middle East. Actually, having a good working relations with countries like particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, their foreign policy is not well really refined, with many problems, internal problems inside this country, and conservatism and human rights violations inside the country. So actually, Egypt is maybe a better player as far as working with the other actors in the region. I'm not saying that Egypt is free of violation of human rights. No, there is, but Egypt, at least, diplomacy is well or more active or more refined. Qatar also is friendly to the USA, and they have US naval base there. So to actually protect the regime, the Qatar regime, and also to be on watch for Iran, okay, in the Gulf area. Also, UAR is, I perceive it as very, very promising country, particularly liberal attitudes toward many issues, and but UAR is very much limited due to its weight in the region in terms of very small a country, population is very small, and so on. Next, please. During particularly the USA did not intervene much in direct way in the Arab-Israeli conflict until Israel and Hamas, they started conflict, and Israel start to bomb Hamas, because the strip after Hamas provoked Israel by sending, launching missiles from Israel. Okay, but in the meantime, Biden administration, they dispatched their team, like Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, to start to get engaged with the leaders of the region. Next, please. The Biden administration signaled its intent to rebalance America, particularly this issue. The Biden administration was trying to create a diplomacy based on supported by military presence in the region. So actually, the whole issue of deployment of U.S. forces in the Middle East, and Afghanistan were under reassessment from the Biden administration, of course, in consultation with the leadership in the Congress. Okay, so actually they wanted to the whole circumstances, particularly after COVID-19, imposed on the Biden administration to fulfill some of his campaign promises, which is minimizing sending U.S. troops abroad, and started already, particularly Afghanistan, to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and all of us witnessed that the withdrawal was not planned very well, with several complications in the region. Next, please. The particularly May 2021 conflict between Israel and Hamas actually imposed some or put some pressure on the USA to intervene or try to mitigate the conflict. But actually, here again, the Biden administration preferred to use Egypt to broker peace between Israel and the Palestinian Hamas, and actually it opened some communication between the administration and the Palestinian Authority, Mr. Abbas. And again, one positive aspect is that we know that Trump administration stopped sending aid to the Palestinian Authority, but which caused again anti-US sentiment among Palestinians and Arab and Muslim countries. But Biden administration again renewed US aid to the Palestinian Authority. Next, please. The crisis that erupted in May 2021 drew the US into a role of working with key regional actors. Here again, Egypt. Egypt is very important, particularly here. Egypt has the most powerful army, navy, and the air force, of course, second to Israel, and also has influence over the Arab countries by virtue of the soft power it has, okay, and the culture, leadership culture over particularly the Arab state. So Egypt, from my view, they did a good job, and the President Sisi, he promised to contribute $500 million to rebuild Gaza Strip after the event. Okay, next, please. Now we can compare Biden administration with Trump administration as follow. Some comparison. Next, please. Next. Okay. Biden administration entered the office without ambitious plan. Actually, when President Trump, he was running for office for the White House, he made some campaign promises to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict and move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But Biden, when he was running for office for the White House, he did not really have much ambitious plan on the Arab-Israeli front, more than this beginning. But after he took office, he started to mitigate or remove or reverse some of the policies of President Trump. Next, please. The Biden administration announced some 388.5 million in aid to the Palestinian. This was received very well by the Palestinian and the Arab during this time, including the resumption of funding cut by previous administration, Trump, and also contributed 183 million for the UN Relief and Works Agency, and which is working basically with the Palestinian. Okay, next, please. During the most recent conflict in Gaza, the Biden administration engaged in quiet backdoor diplomacy with Israel and Egypt to bring about a ceasefire after 11-day fighting. And Egypt here played very, very important role in this process. And I believe it ended up with stopping the fighting. I mentioned here Jordan also played role in the process, but Egypt was more, because Jordan and Israel, particularly in the last 2 years, there are a lot of tensions between Jordan, which signed the peace treaty with Israel, because of the expanding settlement to the West Bank. Next, please. Again, also the situation start to get better in the region with the new leadership in Israel, succeeding Netanyahu, who was very much conservative, extreme right, and was delaying any process of moving toward two states for final peace to between the Palestinian and Israel. So I hope the new leadership in Israel will have the courage enough to realize that no lasting peace in the Middle East without two states. Never it will happen. See, the Shia and the Muslim, the Shia and the Sunni Muslim, they may have their own differences, but one issue or two issues, both Shia and Sunni Muslim, who constitute more than 1.8 billion of the population of the world, both of them, they want two states, Palestinian democratic state in Palestine, side by side with Israel. Next, please. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the new the new, or the Arab and the Middle Eastern, they look at the new leadership in Israel with some uh, uh, optimism, and they are hoping that the new leadership will realize some facts, okay? And so far from, to the best of my knowledge, the situation now is getting better as far as communication between the Palestinian Authority and the new leadership in Israel. Next, please. Second 6 month. Okay, next, please. By the time 2021 came to a close, Biden's first month in office have been marked by what experts say is a passive model Middle East policy. But from my view, really, President Biden, he could not do more than what he did, considering the COVID-19 at home and the economic crisis at home and many internal issues. So actually, from my view, the Biden administration did what the maximum, okay? A senior Biden administration official spoke on a condition of anonymity earlier this month, appeared to acknowledge this point, telling reporters that Washington was not trying to transform the region. So actually, President Biden acknowledged the realist views of international relations, that even a superpower like the USA cannot transform region like the Middle East with all the complexity inside it. Next, please. Here again, I am quoting from one member of the Clinton of the Biden administration. We are not trying to achieve the unachievable in the Middle East. Means that we have to be careful. We have to be modest on our expectations of any progress in the Middle East. Particularly, we should focus more on the U.S. national interest and on the national interest of our friends here, and the national interest of the U.S. friends is very much Israel, keeping Israel safe. And I believe many people also in the Middle East, they want Israel to be safe, okay? And they want Israel to be safe, but in the meantime, they want Israel to acknowledge the Palestinian right to have their own state. Of course, I didn't focus much on Iran because the theme of the conference of the Middle East dialogue is very much dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict. Next, please. Okay. Next, please. Biden foreign policy toward the Middle East is in some ways is continuation of the Trump administration. Particularly, the Biden administration did not object explicitly or implicitly even, that the US embassy moved from the Trump administration, moved US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Of course, this made many people in the Arab and Islamic world unhappy, because moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem with the objection of the UN, most members of the UN members, of course, excluding the Security Council, but the almost 90% of members of the UN expressed concern about moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem before deciding the final status of this international city. Also, other important issue which the Biden administration shied away from dealing with it, which is Trump administration recognition of Israel claim over the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. This is also other issue which Arab policy makers are not happy with it. Okay, next, please. The Biden administration also fully embraced Trump normalization effort between Israel and some Arab states, including the UAR, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, and actually to embrace, to broker the very important proposal, the Abraham Accord. I personally believe, and many analysts from the Middle East, that we should give Trump credit for this achievement. Okay, having more Arab countries to open diplomatic and peaceful relations with Israel is good, okay, in one hand. But also, on the other hand, Israel, the USA should put pressure on Israel to work toward two states, okay, one for the Israel and one for the Palestinians. Next, please. Okay, and this very much reflected in U.S. Secretary of State Blinken public statements, who actually said we encourage more countries to follow the lead of the countries who opened diplomatic relations with Israel. Next, please. Again, from the point of view of Arab analysts and Middle East analysts, Israel security still remains the top priority for the Biden administration. Very much he is following U.S. foreign policy position since World War II, very much supporting Israel, particularly after 1967 war between Israel and the Arab states. So actually, okay, so Biden administration is very much following this line, which is very much due to the internal political pressures by the Jewish lobbyists under the leadership of AIPAC. Next, please. Biden has restored some, again, Biden, as I said, he, in a very calm way, he mitigated some of the moves which Trump did. So Biden renewed facing or saving, he restored some of the aid which was stopped during Trump, and his administration has said it supports a two-state solution, two-state, but actually it is saying it very very cautiously, not loudly, the Biden administration. Here again, the Biden administration, he served under Obama. He was VP, Obama, vice president, and he was very much involved in the process toward two states. But now he is president, but now he's a president in very difficult circumstances, internal and external circumstances, particularly now with a new conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. This is putting more pressures on the Biden administration to move the priority from the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Middle East entirely to focus on Europe. Next, please.
Professor Zoni, I don't know if you can hear me. I was thinking that maybe we might give Professor Lazin his opportunity now for the next
Sure,
30
yeah.
minutes to go ahead and talk. And then I know I have a few questions at the end, and some of our attendees might as well. But at this time, if we could please give Professor Lazin an opportunity to talk about the Abraham Accords, implications for the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And Professor Zoni, we appreciate your talk.
Sure. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed the talk very much, and I think that some of what I have to say will overlap with what Professor Zoni has presented. I'm going to be talking about the Abraham Accords 1 year later, implications for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Can you put up my slides, please? Or they're up? I can't see on my screen. Okay, very good. Okay, next slide. My analysis is, I wrote a paper about a year ago for a Chinese publication in Mandarin, they translated, about the Abraham Accords. And when I heard about the conference from Dan Gutierrez, I thought about presenting a paper, which I'm doing now, which looks at what I wrote a year later and really asking the question, did my disdain of Trump, President Trump, color my analysis? I was very curious as I had this bias. I have a personal bias against Trump. I see him as a threat to American democracy. Has nothing really to do with Israel, etc. And as a result of that, I was curious, maybe my analysis a year ago, since this was Trump's big victory in international relations, foreign policy, maybe it colored my analysis. And my analysis focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Sunni Arab states alliances, the motivation of the signers, winners and losers of the Abraham Accords, some unknowns, and the implications for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Next, please. Now, this past year, if we look at what's happened this past year, I would say, and this is not my field of expertise, it was a smashing success for Israel-Arab relations, the Abraham Accords. If you look at the UAE and Bahrain, there was ambassadors were established in all the countries. Tremendous increase in trade, especially between the UAE and Israel. Senior government officials, foreign ministers, prime ministers visited both sides. Tremendous amount of investment from the UAE and Israel, and then many agreements. For example, my university, Gurion University, signed an agreement with universities in either Bahrain or UAE. There have been agreements in healthcare and in commerce, in health, etc. Now, other Arab states have joined in and continued. Morocco, Sudan, and it's also, there seems to be on a side effect that it's affected Israel's relations with Egypt and Jordan as well. Everything seems to be improving, and even the alliance, this Sunni Arab state Israeli alliance against Iran seems to have been strengthened. And here you see the involvement, without a doubt, of Saudi Arabia. Although one point which should be emphasized, Saudi Arabia has not joined the Abraham Accords, even though it has no objection at all to those Arab states participating. And to some extent, some of the military coordination or intelligence sharing between Saudi Arabia and Israel has increased during the past year, but they're not part of the Abraham Accords. Next. Now, in my article about the Abraham Accords, I looked at, I commented, and I think it's true that these are treaties between Israel, the UAE, and Israel and Bahrain. Now, the fact that they're treaties, they're not peace treaties. We'll bring that point up later. This is perhaps the most important foreign policy achievement for President Trump. A huge breakthrough. It changed the Middle East, according to some journalists and academic scholars that look at the Middle East, particularly from the point of view, from an Israeli point of view. See it as a huge breakthrough, and it's changed the Middle East. It's not the same Middle East before Trump and after Trump. Now, some of prior Trump's actions in the Middle East, and my Professor Zoni commented on these. He moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in 2018. He withdrew from the Iran agreement in 2019. Now, we know he didn't replace it, and we see what's happening now. There's a big question now because of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. There seem to be complications. It could be, and this will be one of the ironies, that Trump's cancellation of the Iran agreement might be his most significant foreign policy action. And I mean that in a negative sense, not in a positive sense. In other words, it might turn out in the long run that that's going to be the most significant thing and not the Abraham Accords, unfortunately. And also the State Department recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights, which was talked about before. Next slide. Now, formulating the accords, the person in charge was Jared Kushner. He seemed to succeed here in contrast to his fighting or leading the fight against the corona vaccine in the United States. He was preparing the deal of the century. The deal of the century was not the Abraham Accords, but peace between Israel and the Palestinians. He proposed Israel would annex 30% of the West Bank. Bibi actually considered doing that, but Bibi neglected and wanted no part of the other part of the deal of the century, where the Palestinians would get 70% of the West Bank, but they eventually would get a demilitarized state that would have to meet the security needs of Israel and other conditions set down by Israel and the United States, which were never enumerated. Palestinians rejected the deal of the century. As a consequence, the UAE suggested to the United States that if Israel would not annex the West Bank, the 30%, it would establish diplomatic relations with Israel. That's probably what led to the Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, the two agreements. Again, peace agreement. Trump referred to it as the peace agreement, that Bibi did as well, although Israel never had war with these two Arab states. So some people suggest, since the people of Israel and the people of the UAE and Bahrain never fought each other, maybe it'll lead to a warmer peace than the previous agreements between Israel and the other Arab states. Let's hope so. Next, please. Now, accords in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Now, in principle, or in fact, the accords did not ignore the Palestinians. However, they settled with Israel, the two Arab states, before settling the Palestinian issue. And some people say they violated a taboo established by the Saudis. The Saudi peace proposal in 2002 talked about the whole Arab League making peace with Israel, first solving the Palestinian issue. Once that's solved, then you'd have peace with Israel. What the accords did, the Palestinian solution was not a precondition. They mention in each of the accords, we have to deal with the Palestinian issue. And then they also pointed out, well, look, Bibi Netanyahu did not annex part of the West Bank. We prevented that. But that's an important point to keep in mind, is as though the Palestinian issue was pushed under the rug, pushed to the side, although it was mentioned. Next. Now, the motivation. What motivated Kushner, Jared, the son-in-law? Well, he failed with the Palestinians, so it was much easier to deal with the Arab states in Israel. Everyone seemed to be concerned about the Iranian threat. From the Arab point of view, but also maybe from the Israeli point of view, both sides, and this was touched on by Professor Zoni, they were concerned about the fact that the United States is pulling out of the Middle East. It's becoming much less important what's going to happen. So maybe we ought to get together with our friends against the threat of Iran. Jared was also concerned about the American election. Trump was doing badly, the virus, which Jared contributed to. And again, if you make peace between Israel and the Arab states, the evangelical base loves it. Some of you Jewish voters who aren't crazy about Trump might also be turned on. And Trump is seen as the great statesman. From Bibi's point of view, he had elections as well, 2 or 3 in 2020, 21. This would help him. He'll be seen as the statesman. As far as the settlers are concerned, we're not going to annex the West Bank, but we're not canceling the idea. We're delaying annexation. And then for Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, the Sunni alliance is strengthened. He gets planes from the United States, which Bibi denied that he approved to the Israeli voters and to others. There'll be no annexation, and concern about the receding U.S. from the region. Next, please. What are the unknowns? Now, in my paper, and here I was wrong, clearly wrong. I think in every other way I was not that wrong, but I also don't think that my bias from Trump my bias towards Trump affected what I wrote. I raised the question, what about the citizens of the UAE and Bahrain? Will they support it? What we call the Arab Street. Some of the criticism of when Sadat made peace with Israel was considered a cold peace. The Arab Street didn't support it. The same with Jordan, etc. Now, I think I was wrong on this. Now, why? Because, I mean, there have been follow-ups to the agreements in the Abraham Accords. Tens of thousands of Israelis go to Bahrain and the UAE, have gone since. Tens of thousands, probably in the hundreds of thousands of people. Israelis are going there en masse, and they're received, they're welcomed warmly. There are all these types of programs in both countries, etc., very different. But the point is I made a mistake in terms of understanding these two countries. If you take a look at the population of the UAE, it's about almost 10 million. Only 11.5% are citizens. Everyone else is a foreigner. I mean, that's an amazing thing. I should have remembered that because I once taught a course on citizenship. Same in Bahrain, only 20% of citizens, incidentally, 70% of them are Shia. So the Arab street in both of these countries is very different from the Arab street in Jordan or in Egypt. Now, the other Arab states, I was skeptical as to whether they would follow, but Sudan is still in more or less, or it's moving ahead. And Morocco, there's been tremendous improvement of Israel-Moroccan relations. They were also party to it. The Saudis are still on the outside, no movement there. Now, I argued that if no progress is made on the Palestinian issue, then the Saudis and other Arab states would not get involved. I may have been wrong. And Professor Zoni, I don't know if he'd agree or not, but it's still too early to judge. Now, I would suggest, and here I'm going to disagree with Professor Zoni when he talks about the one issue. I mean, I disagree with you slightly. The one issue that unites Sunni and Shia is the idea of a two-state solution. It might be that what the Abraham Accords tell us or teach us, although it's early, is that some of these Sunni states prefer stronger ties with Israel than they do with fighting for Palestinian rights. As Arafat used to say, year after year, who sells me out? My Arab brothers. When he referred to the various states making deals, Egypt, Jordan, making deals with Israel or just not pushing the Palestinian issue, et cetera, et cetera. We should keep, that might be, in other words, it might be that in the long run, maybe I've been wrong about this, that if you really want peace in the Middle East, it's Israel with the Sunni states against Iran. That's the issue, not the Palestinian issue. And I say, unfortunately, and that's unfortunate for Israel, which would be my next and almost final point. Let's move on. The options for the Palestinians, you know, some people argue, and this is in the paper, will the Palestinians realize that they have to change and be more flexible or lose an opportunity? In other words, they watch these accords, they're left out, maybe they have to become more flexible. Or will they continue the struggle with terror, with negotiation along with terror, another intifada, have no choice? Some people even suggest there's another option here, and that is, let's have a one-state solution. From the Israel today goes from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. We're almost a majority, maybe we are a majority, one person, one vote. That should be our struggle, et cetera. We'll have a Palestinian majority in the state of Israel. Who knows? Now, Netanyahu government, they oppose two states. Most Israeli leaders, I would argue, and I argue in my paper, have never really considered the Palestinians an existential threat to the future of the state of Israel. Only Tzipi Livni did. Now, however, there's been one change during the last year, as was noted by Professor Zoni. We have a new government in Israel with Bennett as prime minister, willing to, even though he's not a fan of the two-state solution, he's negotiating again with the Palestinians. There's also an Arab party in the Israeli government for the first time in Israel's history, Ram. Mansour Abbas, its head, he's a Muslim fundamentalist. He accepts Israel as a Jewish state. A lot of his colleagues criticize him for that, but that's, maybe things are changing. Maybe there is hope for some sort of compromise between the two. And let's go to my final slide. Israel controls the area from the Jordan River to the Red Sea. Only a minority of Palestinians have rights, the 2 million citizens of Israel. But most Israeli leaders can live with occupation and live with this Israel controlling the area from the Jordan River to the sea. And I quote here Jeffrey Goldberg in Atlanta, warning about the Abraham Accords. They are good if it checks Iran and its, quote, terrorist proxies, but if they cause Israel to avoid coming to terms with the reality that its continued control over the lives of millions of Palestinians threatens its democratic nature, then both the Palestinian aspiration of nationhood and the Israeli dream of a free and strong democratic haven in the Jewish ancestral homeland could be victims of this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lazin, for that that good look at the Abraham Accords. And now we're going to open it up for any questions. I know we have some attendees that might possibly not feel comfortable coming off of mute, so you can also write those questions in the chat, and I will try to speak those. I was wondering if, while that's going on, if I might have our panelists possibly address some predictions for U.S. administration involvement in the Middle East while this conflict is currently going on in Ukraine area. How do you perceive the administration's involvement in the Middle East, considering this conflict that's currently going on at this time? And I just open that up for any.
Okay, I'll just very briefly say one thing I think which is interesting to me is the fact Russia's in the Middle East, and Russia has very close ties with Iran. And the recent bombing in Iraq, evidently the Iranians were going after an Israeli site in Iraq, whatever that means. And one of the things that's interesting with the Russia and the Ukraine, the Israelis are on the line. They're not really, I mean, they're criticizing Russia, but they're cautious. And I think that's causing some anger in Washington. And I think it's an interesting implication of American-Israel relations, how they might suffer because of what's happening in the Ukraine. And that in turn will affect everything in the Middle East.
Mm.
Yeah, I believe what's going on now in Europe and the war between Russia and Ukraine will delay the Biden administration efforts in the Palestinian-Israeli issue, I believe. And as my colleague, Professor Lazin, said also, Russia is very important player in Europe and also in the Middle East. See what I mean? When President Putin supported Bashar al-Assad, he survived, you know, he survived the Arab Spring, you know, so actually it's very important for President Biden to make it his administration priority first, the priority to deal with Russia now. Yeah.
Excellent. I don't see any questions coming in the chat. If any of our attendees would like, I remind you, if any of our attendees would like to come off of mute, they can ask a question of our panelists. Again, Professor Zoni and Professor Lazin, if anybody would like to ask any further questions. Professor Lazin, might you add to what Professor Zoni stated about the future of relations with the Biden administration in the Middle East, concerns that the Biden administration has been much more conservative in its dealings in the Middle East, and now with the war? Do you have anything to add?
No, I thought, well, the only thing I would add is it seems to me that the Biden administration is much more concerned about Asia and China than it is about the Middle East. It's cautious. And I agree with his analysis. It began, and it probably would have preferred to be even more cautious about what it did in the Middle East, but certain events pull it in, whether it wants to be involved or not. I mean, I think from an Israeli point of view, it has excellent relations with this administration. I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me, just one issue which I didn't follow that closely, is the consulate, the American consulate in Jerusalem. That was very, very important to the Palestinians. When there used to be an American consulate, which the Palestinians used in Jerusalem, and it was to the best of my knowledge, it was independent of the American embassy in Tel Aviv. It was like the embassy of the Palestinians without officially being so. Trump closed it, and they moved the embassy, and there's one embassy in Jerusalem. The Palestinians pressured, they very much wanted the consulate to reopen in Jerusalem alongside, and the United States, for a while they were wavering, but to the best of my knowledge, it's not being open until further notice. So that's all.
Yeah, here I would add that the Trump administration achievement was very much allowing or brokering more Arab states to have open diplomatic relation with Israel. Okay, this I would say in itself is good, but moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is just complicating everything's there. The whole situation is more tense, is more tense, and now many Arab policy makers, particularly after they saw how Putin is successful in Europe, and no member of NATO intervened, okay, and Biden administration said he will not work on no-fly zone over Ukraine for fear of World War III. See what I mean? Now, many Arab policy makers and people in the street, I listen to them, watch them through Facebook and all stuff. They said, really, Putin, he is the one really we should work with to help us to regain Palestine. See what I mean? Okay, the other also, Arab also view in the streets, see how the Biden administration mobilized the entire world because Russia invaded Ukraine. But what is happening in Palestine and the Palestinian territory, what Israel is doing to the Palestinians since 1967 until now is more than what Russia is doing to the Ukraine. See what I mean? The analogy, and the USA is not mobilizing the world to help the Palestine. Okay.
Okay, I don't know if I would agree with the analogy, but the one thing that I would say it seems to me that with Putin versus the President of the United States, Biden, I think the jury is still out. In other words, if you take a look at the first couple of days of the confrontation in the Ukraine, Putin had a certain image, Biden had a certain image, strength and weakness. As time goes by, it's not so clear that that's the reality. Putin, this powerful country called Russia, which stands up and fights and doesn't compromise, they're having trouble in the Ukraine. Their army is bogged down, et cetera, et cetera. And the same destruction they did in Aleppo, they're going to do in the Ukraine. But now, since they're Europeans, people notice and see it. But the fact is that if in the long run, Putin fails in the Ukraine, I think that's also going to influence the Arab countries vis-a-vis the United States and Russia. That's all.
Well, we have a few more years of the Biden administration, and we'll have to see how this plays out. But that pretty much concludes the Middle East Peace Process Conference with Professor Zoni and Professor Lazin. We'd like to thank you for your presentations and thank you for this opportunity to hear your recent research into these areas.
Thank you very much, and I thank you and your team and Daniel, Mr. Daniel, the executive director of the Middle East Dialogue, and his team. Thank you very much, and I hope soon we'll meet face to face.
Thank you also.
Thank you.
I express the same sentiment to Reema,
Yes.
who coordinated the Zoom. Much appreciated.
Yes.
Thank y'all very much and
Thank you.
appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.